Thursday, May 12, 2016. This is a budget workshop meeting for the Prescott City Council. I want to welcome everybody who decided to come here today and participate. Listen to what we're trying to do, both the staff and the public. This workshop is going to be working on the FY17 budget for the city of Prescott. We have a lot of work ahead of us today. 3 hours. It's going to be pretty extensive discussions. We'll be taking a break at 10 o'clock and another one at 11 o'clock. But again, feel free if you need to use the facilities and get a cup of coffee, go ahead and do so. So we're going to try and keep moving right along because we do have a lot of ground to cover. This time we'll have the Pledge of Allegiance led by Councilwoman Williams.
Please join me. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Mayor Holder.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr. Here.
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 Thank you, Mayor and Council. Today's workshop, as you know, will focus primarily on the general fund with the special purpose and enterprise funds to follow on May 26th. For your information, 2 documents have been provided, the Part 1 budget book and a second volume, which is a compilation of supporting documents regarding positions and capital project details. These budget books will be available to the public on the city website, as has been the case of all documents of this type following the meeting. The Part 1 budget book includes some material that you will have seen before, council and public will have seen before. We do that to include it for background, to present a more complete picture. For example, the sources of revenue that the city has and the many restrictions that are on them as to use. For the benefit of the council, please break in, pose any questions you have during the presentation. As the mayor said, there's quite a bit of information in the public and the budget books, so please feel comfortable in doing that. There will be 3 more opportunities for formal opportunities for comments, questions, and discussion regarding the draft budget which is before you. May 26th, which we've mentioned, which is the Part 2 budget workshop. So if there are questions which come up today, additional information, so forth, which is needed, we can present that information at the Part 2 budget workshop without waiting a couple of weeks thereafter. The second opportunity will be at the council voting meeting of June 7th, and that is the meeting at which the council is presented with the tentative budget for consideration of adoption. And then finally, the council voting meeting of June 21st, at which the adoption of the final fiscal year 17 budget is to be considered. By means of introduction, I would describe I would describe fiscal year 17 based upon the projections that are reflected in the documents you have before you, some of which are city projections, but also projections of other parties, including the Arizona League of Cities and Towns. And so I would describe fiscal year 17 at this point as a lull of sorts, which is kind of an interesting way I would think to describe it. And there are really 2 reasons for that. Number 1 is an improved economy and some bumps in revenue which will be presented to you. You'll see what those are. But secondly, we prepared for the fiscal year 17 budget during fiscal year 16, specifically through the mid-year 16 budget adjustments, which were effective on the 1st of January of 2016. And so you'll recall that the goal of those mid-year adjustments was to come up with a combination of expenditure reductions and revenue enhancements totaling $1 million. So effectively, we had already taken $1 million out of the budget, and so that made it a little bit, I wouldn't say necessarily easier, but certainly more straightforward. Despite the circumstances that we have been describing for several years now, through teamwork, I'm pleased to say that we are able to bring to the Council a balanced general fund budget that importantly covers operations without dipping into reserves, and that's very important. With respect to personnel, also it's very important that the draft budget includes implementation of the market compensation pay plan as we previously presented it, and that will be summarized and is summarized in the Part 1 budget book and will be touched upon again this morning. While there are some additional position reductions in the draft budget, those positions are vacant. So we're not here today to tell you about layoffs that are being recommended. Funding for capital projects and items in the general fund is bare bones, but it addresses those projects and that work which really does need to be done. And finally, it goes without saying that this general fund budget that we are presenting to you for fiscal year 17 will continue to be heavily impacted by the city's financial obligations to the public safety personnel retirement system. So if I describe a lull of sorts, that has not gone away, and despite the picture that we're going to be able to paint to you today, we need to keep that in mind, and I'm sure we're all doing that. As described in great detail preceding the August 2015 sales tax initiative, and since you may recall the presentation by the Reason Foundation, which provides some pretty good background of why this has emerged fairly recently and what the prospects are going into the future in the absence of a supplemental funding source. So we still have that same issue. That issue without any supplemental funding will continue to play out over the next 2 decades. And so we're here today, and it's a beautiful day, and we have a lull of sorts, but those walls are going to be continuing to move in on us, pressuring the services and amenities that we want and enjoy. So with that, what we're going to do is Allison Zelms is going to do the initial slides this morning, a group of slides, more general introductory material, background material, and then the finance director will be painting the financial picture, and then we will have department heads, some department heads do overviews, important items, and some of the things which are in the budget for their department.
Thank you, Craig. So as Craig mentioned, we do enjoy a wide array of services in this community, and this slide represents those. Today, in the general fund, we'll primarily be focusing on police and fire, parks, trails, and golf, planning and building, economic development, the library, and general government. So, as you're all aware, because you've been in all of these meetings, we've been preparing for today for quite some time, going back even into the prior budget when the mid-year adjustments took place. So all of those were preparatory to being able to prepare the budget that you're going to be seeing today. And as part of that, we've been talking quite a bit about the different types of funds that we have and the restrictions on the revenues and expenditures that can take place in those funds. Today, primarily, again, we'll be focusing on the general fund, but those other special revenue, debt, enterprise, and internal service funds all play together to be able to fund the general fund. We do charge out to those funds for the services provided from the general fund to the other restricted funds. And this is a slide that you've seen before, updated for the proposed FY17 budget. The blue column, the general fund, is what we're focusing on today, about $35 million. Again, the revenue that supports expenditures to provide operations in the general fund is not restricted, but all of the revenue in the red columns, which is the vast majority of the budget, and we'll be talking about those on May 26th, is restricted to specific uses. Streets and Open Space Fund, restricted to streets and open space, restricted to streets from January 1 of this year forward for the new revenue. The enterprise funds are restricted to what the charges are being charged for, and then again, the other restricted funds have many statutory and local regulations based on voter approvals. So we're really focused on that $35 million general fund that funds some of the primary services that the city enjoys. So today we're here beginning the more formal process of the budget, and although we're going to be talking a lot about numbers and dollars and cents, we really are creating the budget as a plan for the outcomes that we're striving to achieve as a community this coming year. So what amenities are we going to be focusing on? What types of services and what levels of service are we able to afford? Recognizing the pressures that we have from obligations that we cannot avoid for public safety pensions. And then again, just setting the framework. We do this budget within a framework of law and a framework of different resources and resource restrictions. The state law restricts what we're able to charge services for and what we're able to do relative to our taxing sources. 86% of the general fund really does rely on city and state assessed taxes. Those have nothing to do with the level of service that this community enjoys, unlike charging for trash or charging for water and sewer provision. Well, obviously, we're in competition for the sales tax, which is a major source of funding in the general fund. And then primary property tax is restricted. We cannot go to the voters to increase that. The city council is only able by state law to increase that by 2% plus the value of new construction, which is not a significant amount of funding in a $35 million general fund. It's about 86. It's a couple $100,000. So it's just not a huge source of revenue, and we don't have the ability to utilize that as a source of funding. And
Go back to that last slide. Right there you show 7 million. Is that supposed to be 70 million?
that is the approximate amount that we pay annually to public safety pension system. So then, and that boils down to about 76% of the general fund is public safety. That's up from 74.5% last year. And again, 82% of that cost is personnel. We provide services as an organization to the community, and services require personnel and well-trained personnel in order to do that in a positive way. Obviously, as Craig pointed out, the mid-year adjustments assisted in being able to prepare this budget. And the way that the budget was created, it does anticipate receiving the Safer Firefighter Grant. If that does not come through, we'll have some mid-year changes and decisions to make. And again, the city enterprises that aren't relying on the general fund are in reasonably good financial condition, and we'll be seeing those on the 26th. This is, go ahead.
Maybe for next time, could we get a financial analysis of what the impact would be if that public safety sales tax does pass?
That would be a question for Mark Woodfill, and Mark is saying yes. And so this is a reminder of the adjustments that were made in November of 2016. Those are included in this budget, and as we go forward, you'll see how some of those were adjusted to be able to keep moving forward to provide services, and those services are related to the city's strategic goals. So we don't just put the numbers together to make them work. We're focusing on these outcomes to have a stronger local economy, better mobility, managed growth, a clean and polished city, first-class utility system, a vibrant downtown, and obviously a financially sustainable city. And that is difficult to do and complicated, and means that the budget takes a long time to put together because we do have those constraints that I described. So the focus areas for the upcoming budget were market compensation for employees in all funds to enable us to provide careers and advance our quality employees and not advance them onto another job in another community, but be able to keep them here to provide services for our citizens. Obviously, it includes public safety personnel retirement system obligations. Those are included at the full actuarial rate. The public safety response and alternatives were considered as part of creation of this budget. Other general fund services and amenities, and trying to avoid that community deterioration, because we are very reliant on tourism and visitors to provide sales tax that helps support the general fund operations that we enjoy. We focused on resources and partnerships to help to continue to grow the economy with projects at the airport, a downtown hotel and redevelopment options, and then working on the rodeo grounds lease. This budget also includes creation of a $3.8 million restricted reserve in streets and open space from the existing sales tax from prior to January 1, 2016, when the new sales tax went into effect, restricted only to streets. It contemplates aggressive tourism development, business license implementation, and optimizing the vehicle and equipment fleet, continuing to do that throughout the year as we make purchases. Rehabilitation and replacement of streets is obviously important, as well as water and wastewater infrastructure in order to maintain our community, and then responsible water resource management and good and close relationships with entrepreneurial partners. So again, as I said last year, the elephant in the room that we continue to talk about is the public safety personnel retirement system. There have been adjustments made to how that system works at the state level during this last legislative session. However, that will have little to no impact on the existing unfunded liability for the city of Prescott or any other entity that's a member of PSPRS. That is sitting at approximately $71 million, and to pay for that over the 22-year period, it will be approximately $168 million if we pay at the full actuarial rate. So what you can see here is that we have increased since FY 2008. In that year, in that budget year, our required payment for PSPRS, as sent to us by PSPRS, was about $1.8 million annually. And it has grown to about $6.2 million in FY 17, and that's $4.4 million of pressure in the general fund that we didn't have. And you'll also remember a little thing called the recession that was happening around that time as well. So there are a number of squeezes happening, and we do have continuing adjustments for PSPRS to avoid the bleeding going forward, but we will be owing that, the debt, and that is contemplated in this budget. So what that rolls up to this year for all pension systems, both the Arizona State Retirement System and Public Safety Pension System, is approximately $8.5 million of this general fund budget. Well, ASRS is throughout multiple funds, but about $8.5 million total for the budget going towards pension payments. And as you can see, there's two numbers there. That top number is what is contemplated in the budget, and that has PSPRS being paid at the full actuarial rate. You'll recall last year we had opted to phase in, awaiting the outcome of the election in August 2015, and this is the full actuarial rate, which is an increase, obviously, from last year, which is part of what we were preparing for in November when the mid-year budget adjustments were made. So the other thing I want to point out here is this payment does not increase the amount that public safety pension system employees receive upon retirement. It is the result of how the city works, how we have grown and not grown based on the rest of the system and the number of retirees we have relative to the number of employees that we have and the rate we have to go paying in. So our employees aren't getting a huge windfall from this over a Phoenix firefighter or a Glendale police officer. This is simply the cost of providing the pension based on the same rate of pay. So during this time, we haven't been doing nothing. Since 2008, we've made significant changes to the budget in order to absorb the reductions from the recession and also the increases in mandated payments. We've adjusted user fees. We have sold the Elks Theater to a partner that's operating it and renovating it. We have public-private partnerships, for example, at the golf course. We have aggressively utilized asset and maintenance systems so that we're replacing things when we should and not constantly repairing them and paying more than is necessary. We've eliminated programs, and we've had significant reductions of personnel. And obviously, personnel is our greatest asset. We are a service organization. We provide quite a broad array of services for a city of 40,000 people. And this is the organization chart going in for FY17, showing all of the departments. And what we've been talking about and what we're trying to address with the market compensation plan is a very significant increase in employee turnover that has been happening over the past few years. The blue line is PD sworn position turnover rate. You can see that skyrocketing up to quite a high percentage that is not very sustainable for our organization or our community to have quality policing. We do have high-quality police and fire officers and line employees throughout the city, and this turnover rate is costly not only with customer service but training and employee morale. So to that end, this budget does contemplate implementing in FY17 the market compensation pay plan for all employees across all funds, and this is a slide from the February presentation where we discussed how that works, where we're trying to bring people to midpoint within 6 to 7 years of their career if they're performing well, and be able to provide them career and stability working for the city of Prescott. This budget does also contemplate position changes, and this slide includes the mid-year adjustments from FY16 as well as some adjustments that are happening in FY17. And what I'll point out here is that although there are some additions of positions, a number of those are taking temporary employee dollars and making a full-time position because we are having trouble with turnover in temporary employees as well. So we're still able to do some of this without increases to the budget. It's just shifting how we're staffing some of those positions. And what you can see from the adopted FY16 budget to the proposed FY17, we're going from 501 authorized positions to 496.5 authorized positions because of a part-time position there. And again, we have made significant reductions to our employee base since 2008. The high was 573.5 employees, and we're down to 496.5 employees, so significant reduction in staffing. And from there, I will let Mark Whitfield get you into the meat and potatoes.
Thank you, Allison. As we get into the actual financial part of the presentation, the numbers of the general fund primarily here, those of you who've been through this process before, some of these slides are the same, just updated for the new numbers. But we also have taken a new approach that we'll be talking about here, and it'll be in our budget book. All this talk and all this work rolls up into a budget book that we put out each year for the citizens and the general public as to what we're doing and how we're doing it. We have significant changes in that this year, so I want to talk about some of those, and we also have some slides that show that and why we did that. We'll talk as we get there. Looking at the revenues and the other sources, this is a slide we've used before. You either love it or you hate it. I happen to like it. Some people don't. But what it shows is the last 10 years or 11 years of activity in the city's revenue stream. And it's very telling. If we look back prior to this 11 years, way back into the 80s, city's sales tax had always grown every year. Whoops. Did you all see it done? City's sales tax had grown every year. So this, as we got into FY 8, 9, and 10, those were the first significant reductions the city had in its general fund revenue over a very long period of time. As you can see, as we go through the graph, the bottom blue here is the property tax, and that's pretty stable. It's not a huge part of the general fund. The red is our local taxes. And again, they took a dip, and this dip here is what I was referring to, one of the first in a lot of years that we had, which caused a lot of those changes in personnel that Allison referred to. Our state shared revenue is another big part of our general fund. As you can see, as things dipped, we looked at this blue line here, which is charges for services. made sure we were charging for what we should be. We increased several of those charges, so you see that getting bigger as we go. And then the permits as well is an item the council has been talking about. As you can see, we're finally close. We're actually back to where we were back in 2007 as far as our revenue. That's, of course, at that same level, no growth over that, but it did take a while to get back here, and we have made several changes. Looking at the individual revenues, on slide 24, we look at the general, these are all the general fund revenues. We're comparing the 16 budget to the 17 budget with a change column. This percent change is the percent and the change of the budget. This column on the far right, though, is the percentage that each of those revenues is of the total general fund, which is an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about things. So as you can see, we have the local taxes, which include the privilege tax, the use tax, property tax, and some franchise taxes. Total about $18 million in the 2017 budget. We saw significant growth in 16 in the sales tax, and then we projected conservatively into 17. Actually, we were projecting 0 to just above 0 growth in sales tax in 17, but we did have strong growth, and we're expecting 16 to end close to that 14.9 million. We have multiple intergovernmental revenue, but the first three here are the significant ones that we get from the state. It's the city's share of state sales tax and our share of the income tax, as well as the vehicle license tax. And those together make up a huge percentage of our general fund. Those are important. They're important that we keep an eye on the legislature and make sure that those funds stay allocated the way they're currently contemplated and not redirected in any way. We did see some growth in those, even though there is more competition as Prescott grows slower than other communities in the state. That's how those are distributed as a percentage of your community to total citizens in all communities. There was another change this year at the legislature where that adjustment used to happen before every census. So you'd see a big dip or spike whenever there was a census as you responded to your growth. But they're going to start doing that each year now, so any change will be reflected each year as we go. Yes?
Where are federal grants in this list of categories?
Federal grants are in a special revenue fund we'll be looking at later this morning. They're not in the general fund. They do cover general fund services, as we talked about with PANT or with the SAFER grant or other grants. And good time to bring it up, but that's one of the reasons for our new display of how we will be showing the departments and the budget. And as soon as we get to those, I'll point that out. Our other revenues, you can see we have an increase in license and permits. That's, of course, related to the business license that was just addressed by council. We do have an increase in our overall charges for services. Some charges went down because we no longer do those functions, and some went up, like parking and other things. So overall, it is up 11%. Fines and forfeitures are about level. They're showing down, but it's more related to what's actually coming in as opposed to what's budgeted. Again, the fines and forfeitures are our tickets, our parking tickets, our library fines, those type of things. The items that go through the court, a big percentage of those revenues are required to be sent to the state. So we only get a portion of those things.
Martin?
Yes?
Real quick, the license and permits, you said that was the new business?
It's the new business license and the building permit increases and all those things.
And so that number could be lower because there may not be as many businesses as you thought?
Exactly. It is a budget. We do our best to estimate, but since we don't know how many businesses there are in the community, we don't really know what it is.
So Mark, this is then balanced later with what you perceive the cost of doing that?
Yes, we'll go over the cost, and then at the end of it, I'll go through a summary and show you the fund balance of the general fund and where we are.
So I'm speaking to the revenue neutral side of the business license, right?
Yeah, we're not talking directly to that today. We talked about that during that discussion, but I could give you more information if you need it. Property tax, as Allison said, we're very limited by state law as to what we can do with that. For a city, the primary property tax is for the general government. That's what's in the general fund. Secondary tax is related to voter-approved debt issues. The city currently only has one of those. That was for the Lakes purchase, Willow and Watson, and the final year of that debt issue is this year. So this is the last year of the city, 2017. The last year we'll have a secondary property tax rate until there's another election. And the final bullet there is important to point out that citizens that live outside the city don't pay city property tax, but they do belong to fire districts, which are higher, significantly higher than the city's tax rate. That's what we're showing in this graph here. The city's tax rate and amount on a $200,000 house is shown across the bottom of the screen. The blue is primary, the red is secondary. As you can see, the secondary dwindles to nothing. Approximately a $200,000 house pays $60 in the city. Outside the city, you'd be in the central Yavapai Fire District, and a $200,000 house would pay close to $550 a year. So, there is, a significant revenue source out there for that fire service that the city does not have. These slides we do every year just to kind of break down property tax. We won't go into any great detail. This is looking at the last property tax. There are more there for your reference to show that residents, as we said, would pay $486 more a year if they're just outside the city limits than if they were in the city. A business at $200,000 would pay close to $900 more being outside the city compared to inside the city. And again, there's our property tax rate. You can see our secondary rate is significantly dropping this year as we attempt to use up the remaining fund balance to make the fund equal zero as the debt pays off, which is, of course, the goal. So overall, we do have a reduction in our tax rate. This, and before I go on, the primary tax rate, as we put in the budget, does contemplate council assessing at the maximum levy. That 2% increase that Allison was talking about that we didn't do last year, and again this year we have that 2% option. So we are proposing to exercise those two. I believe it brings in an additional 80,000 to the general fund. Not significant, but we are recommending that happen, especially based on the actions of the legislature this year. The city lost significant capacity back in '06 when the legislature decided if you hadn't levied it, you didn't need it, and reset your caps at your levy. We lost about 1.5 million in capacity in the general fund when that happened. So we felt it was better just to, we can use it in the general fund to help fund public safety, so we thought it was a good idea to present it in the budget. We have a few slides here related to sales tax. This details them. This is a graphical representation of that slide. And again, just to remind everybody, Yavapai Reservation is a reservation again, 7.85, but Chino at 10.35, Prescott Valley at 9.8, and Prescott at 8.35 with our 2%. And again, those other communities do not provide police, or do not provide fire, do not provide airport, do not provide the recreation options that we have here, all the other services that we have here. But we are very low, very competitive with only 1% of this 2% going to the general fund. So the other side of the equation, as Councilwoman Orr pointed out, is the expenditures. This is, again, the last 10 years looking at the budget. And again, we see the drop in the recession, the cuts that the city made to the operating budget to prepare for those cuts and to make it through those cuts. And as you can see, as we come out, the operations, even if we look at this year, our operations are lower than they were back in 2008. And again, that's because we've changed our service models, we've changed what we do, we've tried to focus our services on what the citizens want, what the council wants, and not doing as many things as we used to do. Again, we have some capital just because through this time period, capital has been kind of on an emergency type basis. And again, we need to address some of those things this year, which we'll talk about in a few more slides. This is a slide of the pie chart of the general fund. I apologize for the egg shape, but we're having trouble with the screen resolution here. As you can see, public safety is 76.4%. These expenses or expenditures are shown net of individual program revenues, which we feel is a better indicator for council. So this is essentially the percentage of the distribution of that tax base, the city tax and the intergovernmental tax that we get. Where is that being spent? Because, of course, a charge for service you don't get if you don't do the service. So we net those out to show where is the tax base being spent. And individually, we will also still look at the funds as a whole, not just the departments, but this is the general fund operating budget. And again, this is netted out of cost recoveries to other funds, but not the net, charges for services. Council is up. We'll talk about that on the next slide. City clerk fluctuates each year mainly based on elections and election costs, so they go up and down. Other significant changes, legal department is down a little bit related to some expenses that hadn't been used that we were able to pull down in the budget. Field and facilities is up in the general fund pretty significantly. Of course, there isn't a lot of field and facilities in the general fund. As you can see, it's at 221. This up is related to some needed maintenance at the parking garage that is going to be happening in 2017. So, I mean, again, the percentage is large, but it's a small charge in the general fund. Economic initiatives, of course, is down related to special events being moved to Parks and Rec, to the tourism expenses being moved to bed tax, those type of things. Finance department is, of course, out of control at an 86% increase. Again, that's the other side of that revenue increase. That was the expenses for the business license. So that's why that is up. Other than that, if it wasn't for that, we were actually down slightly. Community development is up related to additional position there, but they also have increases in revenues, and we'll be talking specifically about those. Recreation, library are both down. We have more detail on those further down. Police, regional communications, and fire are up. And again, that, that's sort of the PSPRS changes, the class and comp increases, and those type of things. Looking at the council budget, comparing the 2 years, you can see a pretty level with some significant increases related to the lobbyist services is the main thing that pushed that. Is we didn't have a lobbyist budgeted in the 16 budget, and we're proposing to have that budget in the 17 if council chooses to renew that contract. Also, you can see there's a cost recovery to the council. Many of our general fund departments are cost recovered to the other operating areas of the city. There was discussion at the mid-year about changing the approach or the methodology by which we do that. This budget does contemplate those changes, and we will be bringing a policy to council, revisions to the budget policy, which will list those out. So with the budget, this is the change, some of the more different slides that you haven't seen before. We're going to be presenting departments as whole units, as opposed to just what's in the general fund and what's in this fund and what's in that fund, to give you an idea of what, how big is Public Works, how big is the police department, how big is the city manager, so you can see where it is. Here, the first part here is a summary of the expenses by operating and capital by their divisions. The city manager, of course, has the city manager's office. It also has information technology, HR, and water resource management is in that department. That gives you a total, so you can see $4.5 million in operations. Well, where is that paid for? Well, this part of that will show that 1.2 million of that is coming from the general fund through the internal charges for IT and HR, as well as what's charged specifically to the general fund. 783 is coming from special revenue. That, I believe, relates to the grants. And then enterprise fund, which is where water resource management is paying for that much of it. And then internal service is more of that cost recovery.
Mark, can you explain the increase in the capital budget line there?
We will be looking at capital in a few slides to
Okay.
look at the specific projects that are part of that. I believe, though, that capital may be related to water resources and will be presented on the next meeting when we look at utilities.
Okay.
And again, the same approach to the police department, where we look at the different police admin, the two bureaus they have for a total operating budget in this budget of 14.6 million, and then the capital items. So where that comes from, and this is an important part to keep in mind, is we split the funding sources in the general fund between their direct revenues, like licenses, dog licenses, and fines and forfeitures for tickets and other things that police issue, to the impact to the tax base. So they impact the tax base for $12.4 million. The other funding comes from here for a total impact in the general fund of 12.8. The other funding source is potential grants. Those are included in operations because if they get them, they'll be operating. But obviously, if the grants don't come in or they don't apply for them or council doesn't want them to pursue them, those expenditures will not happen, but they do need to be budgeted. Again, we have the pie charts, which we had on the previous ones, that show the percentage of personnel, other charges, the internal charges, and supplies. In addition to that, for police and fire, we've talked about the PSPRS and we've talked about the market compensation pay plan. Those have ongoing cost, and these are commitments that you can't just do this year. The market pay plan needs to be adjusted each year as you go, or you end up 5 years from now in the same spot you are today. So we projected out for the next 3 years for police and fire to give you an idea what does that mean their department will increase as they go forward. As you can see, each of those things will have an impact on its own without the other factors that impact an operating budget each year. So we'd be looking at a $278,000 increase next year just related to these two items. Excuse me. And so on, 286 and 294, just in the police department budget for those two items. Any questions on this slide? If not, we'll have the police chief come up and go through the organization and the organizational changes that.
Thank you, Mark. Morning, Mayor and Council, city staff, and members in the audience. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about some of the organizational changes that the police department made, not only in January, but what we're proposing for July 1. In looking at this slide here, this is how we entered January 1. It represented a reduction in several of our areas. One was code enforcement, the other was animal control. We froze 2 police officer positions and a half-time secretary. And in doing so, that certainly involved a lot of conversation internally, looking about, in light of the budget situation that we faced, where could the police department reasonably make adjustments and downsize that would have the least impact on service. And those were the areas that we identified. One thing I would like to mention, and it was brought up by Allison in an earlier slide about, the aggressive tourism and our approach to bring events. Would like to point out that the police department does play a role in that. As we speak, the FBI National Academy Association is holding their spring trainer at the Hacienda. In fact, they basically took over the whole place with overflow, and that was because we have relationships there, and we were asked to host that. But in addition to that, our animal control supervisor, Shannon Gray, she's on the board of directors with the Animal Control State Association. They held their conference here last year. As we speak, the Women's Health Network, Rural Women's Health Network, will be at the Prescott Resort. They'll be staying and spending dollars here in Prescott. We're active with that group. And the Arizona Child and Family Advocacy Network is at the Residence Inn today and tomorrow. And myself and Michelle Medina were on their board of directors at one time. And so we're actively involved in bringing events and others to Prescott to spend their dollars here and bring revenue. So your police department does play a role in that. This is what we're proposing for July 1. This marks a significant decrease in our command level presence. Earlier, when I first arrived in 2013, about a year later, we downsized one command position, one lieutenant. We're looking at doing that a second time here with the July 1 budget. So the command structure at the Prescott Police Department will represent a police chief, a deputy chief, and 2 commanders, and we'll go from 3 bureaus to 2 operating bureaus. And we believe that that will be manageable. In addition to downsizing those positions, we'll also be downsizing one property and evidence position, and the training coordinator position will be reassigned. We're going to move the crime prevention function into a joint crime prevention police services coordinator position. So the crime prevention officer will also now have recruiting and hiring responsibilities. Both of those positions were vacated through voluntary resignations, and we have the opportunity then, of course, to rework those positions. We are freezing an additional sworn officer position with this budget. So we'll be, from January to July, we will have frozen 3 police officer positions in addition to the other positions that you see there. The deputy chief, it's not reflected on this other than that comment there, but the deputy chief will assume responsibility for PRCC oversight. That currently falls to a lieutenant, but Amy Bonney was recently promoted to deputy chief, and she's very familiar with the operation at PRCC, and so those responsibilities for the police side anyway will fall to her. Any questions before I move on to that?
I just have a comment. With all of the new ordinances we have and the challenges we face with trying to get a handle on the recovery home issue, I really feel that we need more code enforcement officers. We just have one person who is wonderful, but there's a lot of stress on that position. So I would be very much in favor of looking at increasing the staffing there.
And if I could comment on that, I had a brief discussion yesterday with the mayor. The suggestion is to perhaps create a task force for code enforcement. Many things have changed since that position. The second code enforcement position was eliminated. Ordinances have been adopted and so forth. But we're certainly in agreement that we need to stand back at arm's length here, look at the totality of the codes which require code enforcement personnel, and then prioritize those and figure out if we need additional full-time paid positions, to what extent can we rely upon some volunteers. We have a lot of interested people like the citizens on patrol who are volunteers and so forth. But I would see us have an in-depth discussion, perhaps leading to a task force, and then an additional in-depth discussions to determine how many net bodies we need to add if in fact that is the outcome.
Okay.
So in looking at some of the areas that are significant, we do have several vehicles from our fleet that'll be no longer with us. We'll go ahead and give those up. The personnel reductions reflect the lieutenant's position, the police officer position, and the two property evidence and the training function position. Training, we're looking at going to maybe an in-service type format. We have a number of general instructors that are Arizona Post. They could meet our certification needs for the sworn side, but we do want to retain a small amount of money just to make sure that we can keep up any other certificates and specialized training that may surface. We've also been pretty successful on grants to provide some of the higher quality training and out-of-town training. The Prescott Police Foundation has actually been helpful to us as well. So we feel like for this year we can give up that amount. And then through reassignments, some of the specialty pay will go away just because of internal reassignments. Those additional dollars that are paid for specialty pays won't be necessary when people are no longer performing the specialty that they're being paid for. The Regional Communications Center, we do have support from the city and from the partners to create an additional supervisor position. This will be a daytime position, and it'll play a key role in training of new dispatchers, which we think will help in retaining those employees. We typically are down 5 or 6 positions there. So we think this position will play a key role in that. And then the computer-aided dispatch replacement, the partners are supportive of that, and we've been working closely with IT on how that moves forward. And then fleet has been wonderful to work with on keeping our vehicles managed, but it does look like going to a higher mileage will certainly result in some savings there as well. We are currently using volunteers to assist Mike Fleming in the code enforcement. It's our intent to maintain that and to also seek out additional volunteers that could help perform that duty. But certainly I would have to agree with Councilmember Wilcox that Mike Fleming is one person, and there's significant pressure on that position right now on a number of fronts to increase our ability to provide code enforcement in the city. Be happy to answer any other questions you may have on that. If I could just comment a couple things before. First of all, thank you for support on the market increase, the comp and class study. The fact that that's still in our budget. Craig, thank you for your support on that. Mayor and council for your support on that. We are bleeding and leaking experienced officers in Prescott. The ability to provide pay raises will be significant in reaching out and maintaining and keeping experienced police officers. And it's not all about the money for these officers. They're thinking long-term impact on their career and their retirement, which all of us do. So by the city stepping up and funding that, even in the midst of tough budget times, that's a statement to our officers that the city wants to retain those employees. So certainly want to say thank you for that that's still in this budget. And we'll work hard to recruit good, talented officers. We do have a number of young officers that we've recruited from our Explorers, and they've certainly been a nice addition here. But the reality is the pay raises for some is what's going to keep them here. So I'm pleased to see that that's still a part of this budget. Thank you for that.
Chief, if I may, real quick, just want to personally thank you for everything you've done for the community, and we'll see you around after you depart, but thank you.
Just a mile down the road.
Okay, City Manager, why don't we go ahead and take a 5-minute break? Okay. 10-minute break, and then come back in 5 minutes.
Yes, could I ask Chief Monahan a question before he
Sure.
departs?
Are we on the right?
Yes, ma'am.
Chief, again, thank you for your service, but I do have a question.
Okay,
You spoke to
sorry.
the comp and class study that we've done and that we're supporting that as a council, and the long-term impact that might have. The other side of that, is there a way that we can get commitment from new officers that we recruit, whether it's fire or police, or we bring them in, we train them, we put a lot of a lot of industries then will say they would like a commitment from this person, and if that person chooses to leave to go somewhere else for a higher salary or for whatever reason to leave, then some way or another that they would commit to us, or that there would be some kind of financial requirement that they would pay back to the city some of the cost, or it just seems like we're a training field and they go right on and get higher pay somewhere else. Is there some type of commitment that we might be able to expect from new officers coming in?
Mayor, Councilwoman Orr, I believe the comp and class implementation will go a long way to giving us the ability to attract talented police officers that would come to work for Prescott. And then as we maintain that over the years and they see that, you know, increases come periodically, they'll stay the course. I mean, we have a beautiful city to work for, a beautiful community. The Prescott Police Department offers a lot to the folks that are here. We have discussed internally when we spend money on specialized training and we develop a skill set for individual employees, we have discussed and probably need to continue having that discussion with HR on getting a written commitment of a time that if we send you to this training, you're going to be here for at least 2 or 3 years if we're going to invest. I believe that's an ongoing discussion that we should continue to have for specialized training. But again, right on the front end, the pay increase will probably be a big factor in giving me the ability to recruit talent to the police force. If I put a qualifier on hiring that does require that commitment, I don't know that would be well received. There's a lot of competition statewide for talented police officers. One of our big benefits, I think, here in Prescott is the ability to attract homegrown candidates that live here, that have roots here, that want to, they're going to stay here. And
like the Explorer program.
the Explorer program is one, but we've got any number of officers over at the police department that they're not going anywhere. This is home. They're prepared to weather the storm with us. But again, at the same time, the willingness of this council and city management to fund that pay increase and then to see it continue to be maintained each year, that is going to be huge. It's a huge signal to those officers and those employees that the city is prepared to support them financially.
Okay. Just an idea, and I think certainly as we do specialized training, there needs to be a commitment because it's expensive to the city. And I mean, if what you're saying, we keep bleeding officers because of the salary, then we up the salary and they continue to bleed. I mean, it just seems that there should be some commitment on the other end.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
The next area that we're going to look at is the fire department. Again, we have the department as a whole here slide with operating budget of 11.9. Again, that's a citywide operating budget, including grants and other fees. Councilman, do you have a question?
Yeah, I didn't mean for the police chief to run off so quick, but he did.
We probably
You know, I kind of have fun with these guys, like doing this. But very similar to the fire chief, police chief. We have codes in this city, and if I'm not mistaken, our police department and our fire department have the legal authority to impose the codes that we have. So the idea that we need to go out and hire a whole bunch more people to simply do what we've already got in place isn't necessarily true. We don't need to expand the budget simply to enforce the laws that we already have on the books. We need the personnel to look at what the priority is and take care of what needs to be done.
Thank you, Councilman. The fire department, again, we're looking at the department as a whole. This presentation, as Allison stated, does include contemplation of the SAFER grant, which council approved applying for. If that does not come about, you know, we will have to look at what changes will need to be made. So with that, we have the operating budget going for the divisions going from 10.5 to 11.9. Again, but if we look down at the source of funding, you can see it is actually a reduction in the tax base use, which is where the pressure is in the general fund, and that's because of that SAFER grant. That budget is in a grant fund, so if that grant does not come about, again, we'll have to look at what does that mean, because there is only $9.6 million in the general fund for funding fire department in the coming year. Also, the enterprise fund is the airport related to the ARF firefighters that are stationed out there for that response. Again, we have our graph showing the percentage of personnel. They all look kind of the same. As Allison pointed out, we are a service organization across the city, so personnel is our expense. We don't have things we sell in a lot of places. It's service. And again, we have projected the cost of the class and comp as we roll forward and need to address those things. And again, we're looking at about another $2.58 million for the fire department each year, just related to the PSPRS unfunded obligation and maintaining the class and comp as we move forward. Those are additional amounts. Obviously, we're paying significantly the first year, and we're paying significantly currently on the unfunded liability. So these are the incremental increases that will be needed each year as we move forward.
So
Yes.
Mark, those were 9 firemen, right, 9 positions for the city?
There were 9 positions. So
the
that's,
difference between 11 and 9, I mean, basically 11 million, 9 million, then that's about what we'd be getting from that grant.
well, that's not the only grant, and we'll be looking at the grants in a few slides. It's not the only cost. I believe that one grant is for the 9 is approximately 950,000,
Thank you.
and that's on a slide further down.
Do those market compensation amounts reflect the current staffing, or do they reflect fully staffed if we had all vacant positions filled?
No, they only reflect the current authorized positions, because that's what's authorized.
Well, even if they're vacant?
Yes,
Yeah.
even if they're vacant, not,
Okay.
yeah, not if they're, yes, if the position is authorized, it's contemplated in the salary budget as well as these projections forward.
Okay.
Any other questions on this? If not, the police chief has a few slides to go through, and fire chief, police chief, one of the chiefs.
Very good. Good morning, Mayor, members of council, city staff, members of the audience. A couple things I wanted to touch on. First off, I, like the police chief, would kind of like to echo my employees' interests as you continue to move forward and offer due consideration to doing something with the compensation. It's critical in the sense that if something, and I recognize the budget process takes a little bit of time still, but if something is done on that front, I think the hemorrhagings that we've experienced over the last year or more years will slow to a slow bleed, perhaps, instead of hemorrhaging out like the heart's really pumping. So I think on behalf of my employees, thank you very much for your due consideration. A couple of organizational charts, and again, this is only representative of a single operating shift in any given 24-hour period. The positions are identified up here should the SAFER grant not be awarded. This is kind of the half glass, half full argument all the time that occurs anytime we have a grant opportunity. And what it portrays is basically our staffing levels as we are today. We're 3 positions frozen. That position came from a position that was in there for organizational or operational capacity that used to be run out of Station 72. That position was frozen January 1st. And with that, it has created a minimum on-duty staffing of 16 persons per duty per day, 24/7, 365. Now, there are occurrences where that number is a little higher, depending on scheduled leaves off, workers' comp, and those kind of elements. But our minimum staffing is 16 per day. That allows us to fully staff 4 fire engines at The primary locations of Station 71 on White Spar, 72 down here on 6th Street, 74 on Smoke Tree, and 75 on Lee Boulevard. And then in those days that we are understaffed or at our bare minimum, it only allows for staffing at 73 of a rescue vehicle and the ARF engineer, because you also have the battalion chief in that position. And those numbers are reflected here. Being the optimist that I am, if the SAFER grant is approved, what it does is allow us to maintain our level of service and actually bring it back to where we were January 1st, actually December 31st of 2015, trying to get ahead of myself, at which time we'd be able to staff 5 fire engines, the ARF truck, and the Instant Commander 24/7, 365. So that all said, hopefully our federal partners look favorably upon it. We done our due diligence, I think, at the local level, but it is a peer-reviewed grant, which means there's professionals from all over this country that go in and review these grants. I'll be one of those professionals back in Baltimore all next week, and hopefully we get a notification of award.
Excuse me, Chief.
Yes?
How many years is that SAFER grant good for if we get it?
This particular grant is good for 2 years, and there is no retention period beyond that 2 years. So if, but we are allowed to reapply. Okay. So in about a year's time frame, if we still are faced with the ongoing fiscal struggles and challenges, then we would look to seek reauthorization or reappropriation of that grant through reapplying for that grant in order to maintain. Any other questions at this point? A little bit about some key information that we're going to touch on a little bit here. We've been working hand in hand with our airport partner, Mr. Cox, and trying to come to some terms as to how we could perhaps modify the aircraft rescue firefighting mission out there and further shore up some of our other ongoing staffing needs on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things we're looking at is to look to staff the ARF position from 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. That gives about an 8-hour window from 10 at night till 6 in the morning, at which time the ARF truck would become uncovered. But it does allow us some latitude to return that staffing back to the fire engine that runs out of Station 73. It would still have a response capability on the airport if they're in quarters. However, if they caught another emergency call off the airport grounds in their primary run area, then that would be coming in from a later area.
Is that going to affect anything with the FAA?
FAA Part 139 requires the ARF to be staffed for commercial aviation. So those are outside, those hours are outside of commercial aviation operating hours.
Okay, thank you.
So Chief, can I ask you on the Engine 71 and Engine 72 if the SAFER grant passes, the 4th firefighter, what are their duties that they would be necessary? I mean, on the before we have 3 as minimum. So what would be the 4th position?
In those, and it's a very rare occurrence that we're at full staffing, that we don't have somebody off on paid time off or approved time off. But if we were flush and there was no paid time off, no workers' comp, no educational leaves ongoing, and we were at 4 persons, those folks are used to shore up that particular crew, 71 or 72. And it just adds ongoing capacity to that engine company. It
So
allows
it's
them
like
to do a little bit more.
Okay, like a substitute, and they could go to other fire stations if needed.
Oh, that happens all the time. Okay. Yeah, we plug people in where we need them in order to maintain our minimum staffing numbers. And for example, on that particular slide there, if the firefighter on Station 74 at Smoke Tree were to be on an authorized absence, one of the firefighters from either 71 or 72 would move over in there to fill in.
Excuse me, Chief.
Yes,
Could you just explain what an average week would be for a firefighter from the standpoint of hours?
Hours worked?
Hours worked, yeah.
Yeah, all our firefighters and most of the region's firefighters all work on a 56-hour work week. They are on slightly different schedules between ourselves and the districts. But normally that entails every other for 3 days and then 4 days off, which equates over a Fair Labor Standards Act window of about 27, 28 days. in our case, I believe it's 24, that they work a given number of hours, 2,916 hours in any given pay period, or over a course of a year, sorry.
Thank you.
Continuing on some of the key information, the ARF truck I was mentioning. The second bullet here is to bid out the fuels reduction service. One of the challenges with this is most of this grant is grant funded. I don't see, in talking with my federal partners and state partners whom we obtain grants from, those dollars amounts are not going to exponentially increase if we do business a different way. We will offer our due diligence to look to outsource that work by the use of private contractors where feasible, or perhaps other partner city agencies. Parks and Recs has been floated out there. But we'll continue to offer a fair assessment. One of the challenges we're faced with is we do a finite amount of work for a finite amount of dollars. The dollars don't change. So if we can hypothetically, using seasonal employees, do an acre of work for $1,000, and an acre of work in the private sector comes in at $2,000 per acre, that relatively means only half the work that we're currently doing gets done. That's just the basis of some basic math on that. But we will offer our due diligence to look at that a little deeper. We've got some cost estimates, very preliminary, and it does look like the private sector is significantly, probably about 150% of what we've traditionally used seasonal employees or variable hourly employees for. But we'll continue to offer some assessment of that to see which is the best way and best approach. We've looked at the costing for a reserve program. And when I talk reserve, these are people that we can use to plug into a system in the absence of our personnel being available. The costs here for the first year operating costs, and none of these are funded in the current budget that's before you, come out to about $252,000. And I have some detail of that if you're interested, and I'll make sure that gets to the city manager as to how the cost breakdown occurs. Unlike most things, we can't just plug in untrained professional, non-professional types, I should say, into a position to fill a vital role to this community. And as such, when we looked at the reserve firefighter program across the state, I was able to locate one community that is still doing one. Most have actually rolled back their reserve programs and gone away from them in their entirety. The one that is still doing it is Kingman, and hence that's the number where we attain their hourly wage and how they use their program. And for us to manage a program, it would take about 15 reserve persons to manage that program. And in addition to that 15, they experience about a 25 to 45% turnover any given year. One of the problems with the reserve program is they're young, up-and-coming folks that want to get a career fire service job started, and they get picked away. And we talked a little bit about attrition with the police department. Fire department's experiencing it as well right now. I spoke to the folks in Glendale yesterday morning. They have a current class of 48 folks. Well, 2 of those came out of our department. They do a regional academy, so the entire valley's picking up people from everywhere. So is it something that we can look at further? Perhaps. However, we would need to have a funding mechanism to fund a reserve program.
Excuse me, Chief.
Hey, Chief, can you quickly explain the difference between volunteer and reserve?
Yeah, that's what I wanted.
And what their duties are?
Yeah, volunteers, the primary difference is nothing changes except a reserve program is a paid position that hours are restricted to that use, and it requires a lesser number of persons in order to execute. Volunteer, on the other hand, is, as the word says, it's a volunteer. You don't get to wave your magic wand and say, well, they're volunteers, so the codes of federal regulations don't apply. It doesn't work that way in our business. There are some opportunities, I think, that we're looking at to use some volunteers to I guess, supplement a little bit of our service in the sense of, for example, battery replacement and smoke detectors. It doesn't take a credentialed firefighter, paramedic, or an EMT to go change batteries in a smoke detector. Likewise, you could counter that with, why does the fire department do it in the first place? Well, one of the reasons is if we don't do it, and then the folks say, well, I'm not going to replace it, then you have somebody with a diminished alerting system within their residence. So it's a double-edged sword any way you look at it. But volunteers don't get compensated. They are issued the equipment. They still have to go through the pre-medical screenings that are required. And if you look at that number at about 252, for an all-volunteer force, you're looking about half that number. $115,000 to run a reserve program is just an hourly wage to allow one reserve, one seat, 365 days a year.
Okay, thanks, Chief.
You're welcome.
Chief, with regard to the movement of reserve firefighters from one community to another, have you looked at or thought about the idea of working with other municipalities and fire districts in the state to create one reserve firefighter program with joint funding so that we're not the only ones who are bearing the burden of training people who are moving off to another community?
I think because of the geography of the state of Arizona and the rural versus metropolitan demographics that all the state faces, it would be very problematic to pursue something on a statewide basis. Even at the local level, and there's some pitfalls to it when you come down, especially in the reserve side, as to how you can retain the folks. You know, you have to incentivize it somehow, otherwise eventually they step out the door and move on. And even at a regional level, the one closest to us, the districts, both of those have scaled back and are disbanding their reserve programs currently. The fourth item, and you know, we talked a little bit about this back in March and April concerning the need to modify our tiered response levels. I think we have the impetus is in place to do that. The fire service regional partners are on board to look at that. The mechanics of that, however, are contingent upon us pursuing and continuing to pursue a updated computer-aided dispatch. Our system's rather antiquated, and as such, we're kind of nearing the true evaluation stage. We've looked at a couple different products that are out there. A couple products meet our needs on a regional basis, and as such, we'll continue to pursue that. But once that's in place, I think then we can do some stuff much more creative than what we get hand-tied sometimes today in our system, running us versus us running the system.
Excuse me, Chief, could you explain computer-aided dispatching and what the advantages of that are?
Yeah, computer-aided dispatching is used across, well, a couple of streets down the road by the 911 center to assimilate a response package for any type of given emergency, whether it's a police emergency to a barricaded subject or whether it's a fire emergency for a technical rescue. It's preset cards, even though they're computer-generated cards, that has a master sequencing addressing guide tied to them. So it ties the address to the responsible resources to make sure the right response package is assigned to that particular emergency. And it's all computerized. So when your address pops up on the screen, the dispatcher or the call taker takes your information, the address is already populated, determines the nature of your emergency, alerts the stations, fire trucks respond, or alerts the radio, police officers respond. And that's what computer-aided dispatch does. It takes the human element out from shuffling through a book looking, well, who goes here, and computerizes that. But ours is fairly antiquated.
Okay. And that's versus what we do now? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We currently use a computer-aided dispatch system, but we can't drill down to geographical specifics in our current system.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
City Manager, I thought, I remember sometime back in 2016, we set aside funding to put in the CAD system. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's a very complex project, but we are now moving actively. They have been interviewing vendors and so forth, and it is contained in this budget, and we want to get it done just as soon as we can.
Okay, so the money that we have in 16 just carries over to 17 whenever we actually implement it?
Well, it's being rebudgeted.
Rebudgeted, okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
I have a question, Chief, appropriate to the mayor's question before regarding definition of volunteer and your comment that volunteers are just that, volunteer. Volunteers don't have a benefit other than volunteering to do what volunteers do. I would take from your comment that volunteers aren't subject to PSPRS, that we don't automatically, simply because they volunteer to help the fire department in some capacity, put them in PSPRS?
I'll defer part of that question to the human resources and the attorneys, but from my perspective, if they're placed in an immediately dangerous to life and health environment or an IDLH environment of some fashion, it could open us up to some degree of exposure by using, credentialed folks in that role.
Well, wouldn't that be a management issue if you know you have volunteer personnel to go out and do such things as, I don't know, you said change batteries and smoke detectors and do things that are not necessarily in life safety situation. They're things that, may not necessarily require a fully qualified firefighter or EMT or paramedic or something. It might be as simple as, code enforcement inspections, et cetera. May not have anything to do with actual in harm's way. It's a volunteer to help the fire department. That was my question. I mean, there may be some options available to use volunteer contingents in the city on certain things that may be a burden on our professional firefighters and EMT, et cetera.
Mayor Pro Tem, you're exactly correct. That's the angle that I am taking on the use of volunteers. To put the volunteers on a fire truck may not be the best solution. However, employing volunteers to go out and do some of the non-emergent type work that our current frontline firefighters do very well may be a place for volunteers.
Thank you.
Moving on, I did, even though it wasn't a solicited request, I did look at the option of charging for services. I've reached out to Fire Recovery USA, which is one of many vendors that do this. They've had some success in the Seligman area. They've had some success in the White Mountain area. One of the downfalls of this is from and this is from a policy decision, is there's many in the population that feel that their services are being provided by their general sales taxes already. For us to pursue cost recovery through, for example, motor vehicle accident billing may be contrary to the community's will and hence your will. That said, I did get some prices based upon 2015 calls for service. The net billables would be about the gross billables would be about 143,000 and some change. Net revenues from that after the firm takes their cut is about $114,000 and some change. And there is a labor piece and a software piece in order to get such a program up and operational, which would spin back to the item above that. It would have to be incorporated within a records management system that's usable for a third-party biller to pursue that. Again, I don't know what the, I guess lack of a better term, the political will is to move forward with something like this. There is some costs that we could recover to the tune of about $114,000, but that's probably up for a different meeting altogether. I was asked to talk about a little bit about fleet and their availability and status. And I'll shoot through this a little quick here, but in the current year, we had budgeted an authority to purchase a battalion chief's vehicle to replace, and we were going to retain the existing vehicle, not as surplus, but as a redundant need. We've tabled that for this past year and the next year, but it's something we're going to have to come back and revisit in 2018. We have a workaround in place. They're going to have to do some sizable maintenance on our current vehicle to maintain its roadworthiness, but I think through our fields and facilities folks, we're able to do that. This is next item's a little hot topic, so to speak, every time it comes up, but we have retained the crew buggies for a number of years beyond the discontinuance of the Granite Mountain Interagency Hotshot crew. We could look at the eventual disposition of those vehicles and some other support vehicles that they used in order to perhaps not necessarily get off our rolls, but to perhaps offshore them to somebody that might have a need for them. We do have a current user that's expressed an interest in this. It will be coming forward, I suspect, here maybe in a couple days, a couple weeks. To your awareness, the movie producer for that movie has expressed an interest in using these. Ultimately, I don't have a stake in it, aside from I have reached out to the families, and the families in their consensus seems that it's a good idea, and I can live with that, but ultimately that becomes a decision of a mutually abided by decision that we can arrive at, I think. They are sitting garaged at the present time. There is a remittance of money that is being offered for their use, so we will offer our due diligence in evaluating that. But long-term fix is we probably need to clear those from our rolls. Current frontline and reserve fleet ratios are appropriate. One of the elements of our ISO study back a couple years dealt with our pumping capacity, which takes into account not only frontline apparatus but reserve apparatus. It was deemed appropriate and was awarded full points. Any dispatching or reduction of our pump-capable fleet, whether it be ladder trucks, engine trucks, would have a negative impact to the overall ISO rating, or could. That said, if it were to drop 2.5 points, we most likely and would experience a degradation of our ISO because of inability to pump. That does not take into account all the time apparatus are staffed. It allows for, which is the next item, maintaining a fleet size significant to manage an event through the use of callback and other means to staff up engines. You have to have a reserve component of fire engines in order to battle the significant event that occurs, but isn't the daily, day-to-day need, if everybody kind of follows the bouncing ball there. You have to have some reserve capacity there. Right now, we maintain one Type 1 and one Type 1 ladder, one Type 1 engine company, and that is appropriate, in my opinion. And with that, that concludes all my portion, unless you have any follow-up questions. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chief. Our next area is recreation services, and again, we're looking at the department as a whole with an overall operating budget of $14.8 million in the coming year, funded from the general fund with obviously charges for services. Also, impact on the tax base is up just slightly because of movement of different positions and things there. The special revenue fund is their grant fund, but also mostly it's the $3.8 million that Allison referred to earlier as a reserve for open space acquisitions. Again, we'll talk more about that reserve at our next budget workshop when we look at the streets fund. The operations in this fund is actually a little more split than the police and fire you saw, with about 54% of personnel. They have a lot of other costs. They use a lot of volunteers. which of course doesn't impact your personnel costs. With that, that's the layout of the financials. We have Joe here to talk about a couple significant points in his area.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. Just some of the key information for fiscal year 17 as we move forward. We take our role, Recreation Services Department, take our role in tourism development very, very seriously. And so you'll see as I go through some of these, where that plays in and how we hope to build on that and create some more spending in the community through visitation. But we've been working currently and continue to work on outsourcing some of the management of the special events that had been previously done by the city. Prescott's Great Outdoors, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the last bullet point. We've successfully wrote an RFP and got an independent promoter to take the 4th of July celebration on, which is saving the general fund about $40,000. We've worked to also contract out the Downtown Summer Concert Series, which has allowed labor savings in that we're not running that event anymore. We've implemented the new parking fees as of February 26th. We anticipate about $80,000 of additional parking revenue in fiscal year 17 because of that. I'll tell you that last month we were at about $12,000, so it looks like we're actually ahead of the curve on that. So we hope to exceed that number if possible. We also have budgeted in the fiscal year 17 for additional pay kiosks at a couple other locations, Joe, which we anticipate, if it's fully implemented, will create an additional $70,000 in revenue.
Joe, I have a question. Looking at the $80,000 and then the potentially $70,000 that you're referencing, does that go back into Parks and Rec, or does that go back to the general fund?
Councilman Lamerson, that goes back to the general fund, which, of course, Parks and Recreation is funded out.
I know that, but I think it's important in these discussions that the public hears that Parks and Rec is generating revenue for the city as a whole that is subject to being spent not only for Parks and Rec, but general government, library, and police and fire. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Lamerson. And then the last bullet point, the Prescott's Great Outdoors event was an event that the city had put on and run, and there was a little expense involved in that. What we're working on now is to take that, which happens in October, which is a great month in the city of Prescott, but unfortunately our hotel occupancies in October are down, in the 70-80% range. So we want to prop that up, and through outdoor recreation and creating events in the shoulder seasons, in the Marches, Aprils, Octobers, we hope to increase visitation to the community. So what we're working on now is a 2-day event that will be based out of Watson Lake that would be a running, mountain bike, and a hiking event over the 2 days with using the Circle Trail as the venue, and then again Watson Lake as the headquarters for it. So we want to build on that. Our hope is that we can build something in the fall that works towards accomplishing what happens in April through the mountain bike race that happens. That started at, I think, 400 bike riders, and now it's up to about 2,000. So we want to get something started there, and again, it's going to create the spending in the community at a time where we haven't capitalized on it. And then the last thing, we just continue to build on our sports calendar to create more visitation to the community and create that spending. We have had discussions with Tough Mudder about bringing an event here that would be a big event, bringing in thousands of participants, and again, the spending that happens in the community, and creating these to be 2-day events or hopefully even 3-day events that have the overnight stays. That's what we're doing too with the softball tournaments. We've grown especially our girls' fast pitch tournaments to the point now where we need to start them on Fridays, and that's going to create that Thursday night stay, and so we're looking to expand on that and continue to work and be a big part of the tourism development for the city of Prescott. So with that, if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer those.
Mr. Mayor? I don't know if it's necessarily for you, Joe, maybe for Mark and the attorney or Craig, but we keep talking about ecotourism. We talk about, you're filling the beds, bringing the tourists in, whether it be bike races, Circle Trail. I'm not talking about the swing set down the block, but wouldn't it be prudent to use some of the bed tax for his budget?
Councilman Lozelle, I can answer part of that. We do statement
that
there.
again.
We do currently have some funding that comes out of bed tax, approximately, I think, $70,000 for our department comes out of bed tax.
Seems to me that you're generating a lot more than $70,000. I just don't know if we can push the envelope and maybe help you out a little bit, that's all.
Joe, I'd just like to, I have the opportunity to serve on the committee with Recreation Services, and I just want to commend your department for what you do and how you do bring in revenue, how you provide for the city, the citizens, and tourism, and the way that you use volunteers. I think it's amazing what you do, and I appreciate it.
Our volunteers are a great asset.
They are.
Thank you.
Next area that we're going to look at is the library, and again, the full department is listed here, the $2.4 million budget. As you can see, the funding on the bottom here is broke out with the library district funding, as well as the charges for services, which include the meeting rooms, the fines and forfeitures related to the books, showing the impact to the tax base. And as you can see, it's down significantly from 16. That's part of those mid-year budget adjustments that the council adopted. So of course that's where you see that. And then the special revenue impact here is related to gifts and donations fund. The library does get several gifts from the community, from the Friends of the Library, from people, individuals, and then their as part of their wills. Again, the graph is a little different than you see with police and fire, where it's 63% at personnel. And again, that relates also to another area that has a lot of volunteers that handle those things. With that, we have a few slides for Roger to discuss some things happening at the library.
Good morning. This slide represents our current staffing, and you'll notice that it indicates that from 16 to 17 we are down one half of a permanent position. This doesn't indicate all of our losses in personnel. Whoops. Sorry. This one. Okay. The 2016 mid-year adjustments, we reduced our part-time salaries by $50,000, and these positions are the ones that allow us to have extended hours in evenings and weekends. So with those adjusted salaries and personnel, we looked at adjusting business hours, and we adjusted the hours we're open with a net reduction of 3 hours per week loss. We also reduced $40,000 in other items. And one of the things that we'll be doing beginning in July is adding rental fees to the meeting rooms, this room, as well as the additional fees that we already collect. The addition of the rental fees will generate approximately, as it says here, $81,700 a year. One of the things I want to do in fiscal year 17 is replace the fluorescent lights in this building. The total cost is probably going to be anywhere between $70,000 and $100,000. APS estimates that the rebate for replacing lights here will be $14,000 with a savings of $12,000 per year. And this will be funded with a donation to the library, such as Mark discussed. This slide shows the Yavapai County Free Library District taxes that are collected from the city. And it also shows the amount that the library receives back. We receive back almost $566,000 in direct contributions, but in addition to that, the money that they retain goes to paying for database subscriptions, the integrated library system, which is the electronic card catalog and other services. They also supply technological support to all the county libraries through Yavapai Library Network. And also it indicates here, obviously, that there are certain things that a public library must do in order to be eligible to receive the monies discussed and to receive grants through the state and the county. And this is included in this slide. This is a slide I'm sure you've seen before. It indicates which library services must be provided without a fee and which ones may have a fee. The library currently charges for all of those services that are listed in the fee allowed column, except for the non-resident card. We get very few requests for a non-resident card. We can look at implementing that fee. It would not bring in a significant amount during the year. One thing I did want to point out, as Joe indicated with his department, we have a lot of volunteers who help offset the cost of operating this building. We have about 140 volunteers that work at the library in all phases, covering books, shelving books, checking books in. So without them, we wouldn't be able to provide the services that we do. And another thing I wanted to mention was that the library is a place that people who are relocating here look at. We hear almost weekly of somebody who's looking at the library, and they're looking for a place to retire. They want to make sure there's a good library here. So we're proud that we're able to present that to the city. Any questions I can answer?
I don't have a question, I don't think. I think I might be very candid with you. Roger, I look at the income and expenses, and I look at the taxes that are generated in the city based on property tax and what is remitted back to the city to help fund the library, which is about $2.3 million budget. And we take in property tax in the city, $900,000, about $450,000 or whatever is given back to the city. Does the city own the library? Is that the city of Prescott's library?
Yes.
What I guess my question would be, what would happen if we contributed the same amount of money as the county's graced us with and put the operation in the county's lap, since they're entitled to put this on the property tax of the folks? What I don't understand is why, if we're taking in $900 and some thousand on properties in the city of Prescott in order to function a library, why the county only graces us back $400 and some thousand.
Well, actually, on slide 53, you could argue that they dispersed 565 plus 155, which is 720,000, which is which is still a reduction of almost $200,000. But we have not had a discussion along the lines of what you're suggesting hypothetically.
I thought we had this discussion the last budget, and I thought by this time we would have already had this discussion.
What I was going to say the Yavapai County is not obligated to take a library. They don't run a library. They run a library district. They are an entity which collects money and then disperses to libraries. So we've never had a discussion, and certainly never had an inclination, if the library people have, that we can turn over the city-owned property to the library, and they're going to accept that responsibility of operating it.
My suggestion is to get with the County Board of Supervisors and have this discussion so where we can try and keep the library whole, rather than looking at ways to keep chopping the services that the library delivers.
Well,
it's very difficult to sit here and listen to a $2.3 million proposal, knowing full well that not all of the dollars that come in to try and function that library come back to the city to help keep that library whole.
Yeah. Well, we have, if it wasn't clearer, we have had discussions with the county about the library and the very issue that you're addressing. At no time in those discussions did the county state that they are interested in taking over a library. We have not had any success in closing the gap of tax collections versus financial disbursements or allocations. What we have heard is that perhaps the city, well, and the county can speak for themselves, but they view this as a library network. It's a community of libraries, just like the city is a community. Different people pay certain amounts, different people receive benefits in differing amounts. Everybody doesn't exactly pay and then get back what they pay. So if you look at it as a community, I think that that's where the county is coming from.
And I understand the comment, and I appreciate your comment in that, but I think we need to have more discussion. I in no way think that the county's prepared to run a library any more than the city should be in the library business, but we are. But the fact of the matter still remains, the citizens of Prescott put up $900 and some thousand to help fund that library. That money should be going to help fund that library. So.
Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Start again after that.
Vote of confidence.
Thank you, Mayor. The next area is community development that we brought forward. As you can see, they have an operating budget of $1.2 million in 2017. If we look down at their funding source at the bottom of the screen here, you can see the increase that will be discussed next week at council related to building permits and inspection fees has reduced their impact to that tax base, to that revenue source that we have for public safety. So a pretty significant reduction there. The other funds and the capital up here are related to the CDBG program, which is run through this department. And again, we're looking back at a more typical general fund division with 85% personnel costs. We also included the org chart here because we did have one additional employee, which was part of the backup book, the detail on it, and that was another plans examiner, building inspector to handle the increasing workload that they are facing up there. With that, Tom Geis is here if you have any specific questions about the department. Otherwise, we'll move on to the general fund capital.
Well, let's go back to that just for a second.
Sure.
You said, so you're going to add one more person?
Yes, another plans examiner, building inspector.
Okay.
It went from, you can see we have one addition here. It went from 2 to 3.
So that'd be a permanent position?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, it'd be filled as a permanent position. Obviously, in the recession, we had a lot of permanent positions we don't have anymore, so.
Is that going to be able to increase our customer service capability?
I'll have Tom speak to that.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mayor and Council. Mayor Oberg, we believe by bringing on the additional staff with a primary focus of plans examining, we can enhance our customer service at the counter. We also think associated with the fees adjustment that you'll be looking at next week, there'll be new services that we'll be able to provide, including a much shorter turnaround, say 3 to 5 days versus 3 weeks for minor related projects such as solar, plumbing, fences, signs, that type of thing. So we believe that the addition of this new staff person would help us very much in being greater response to the development community.
Thank you.
Tom, if I may ask, with the proposed fee increase, do you see maybe this almost being neutralized with this position and those increases?
Yeah, well, and I take it, Councilman Lozelle, you're talking about cost recovery of the overall services what we provide in the budget for the department, and ultimately correlates to the level of development activity. And I think we're reflecting here a cost recovery of approximately 80%. But we're really more comfortable talking in ranges of 75 to 80%. So it's a combination of anticipated and what's been previously experienced in increases in permit activity, as well as the revenue or fee adjustments that you'll be considering next week.
That doesn't include the customer service level that would go up and the happiness and hopefully the satisfying of our customers, the citizens and builders and whatnot that would utilize your department.
Well, that is certainly always our goal, but we believe that will enhance our ability to be more responsive to minor development projects, and it will certainly help us in processing single-family and larger commercial projects.
Great, thank you.
Do you think you're keeping up with all your inspections that you have to do at building sites? 'Cause I know you've had a pretty significant increase in number of permits for building both residential and commercial, I believe, right?
Yeah, and that's correct, Mayor. And in fact, the basis for the request for the additional plans examiner counter help, this person will also have the potential to be an inspector. So it's a combination position, plans examiner, inspector.
Thank you.
And Tom, do you build into your budget the loss of revenue from fee waivers that are negotiated throughout the year?
No, not really. We look at expected projected revenue based off of development activity. So the numbers that we're reflecting, those are our best projections on the fees that we'll be collecting.
Well, I'd like to take a look at the policies we have on fee waivers and, in full disclosure, understand the total dollar amount that would be allowed in any 1 year for fee waivers in pre-annexation agreements or development agreements or, whatever agreements you're working with with the developer.
Well, that's certainly something we can look at.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question too. Kind of goes along with what Gene was asking and sort of with what Greg was asking. Did I hear you correctly? We're targeting 75 to 80% cost recovery?
That's correct.
So where is it intended that the 20 to 25% that we don't recover, where does that come from?
Yeah, I think maybe the best way to answer that is some of the services provided by the department are services that would be provided to somebody that might have an interest in purchasing a property or somebody that just wants to talk about the potential to do an addition to their home. So ultimately, when we're looking at the cost of permits and the fees associated with those applications, we include the cost of personnel and the vehicle and the benefits of the personnel. And as you see, there are other aspects to the overall cost of the department that are up and beyond that. So that's why we look at the 75 to 80% as full cost recovery. And if you recall, back in March, when we made the presentation regarding the proposed fee adjustments, we indicated that this was the first step in the direction of greater cost recovery and that we would be looking at this again next year.
So, Tom.
Thank you.
So, Tom, it seems to me we're talking about the cost and cost recovery, but there's also the benefit that comes around to the city.
That's correct.
For this development that happens to our city, which brings in jobs, which brings in sales tax. I mean, so there's a positive side that's not shown here.
Well, that's correct, and I think it's a very good point. There's a significant impact to the general fund for the one-time sales tax on construction. So there is a correlation as to development activity and permitting, and total valuations of permits is something, a very significant number that's changed over the last 5 or 6 years. And currently, we're a little over 130 million as compared to 109 million last year. That correlates to the cost of permits, but also there's a correlation to the value and the market value and the construction cost and ultimately the sales tax that are generated from development.
Yeah, and then the bigger picture of what this brings to our community, which are the developments, all of the jobs that are coming with this, and then the new people moving into our city. So there's a huge positive side of this expense that isn't brought in by revenue.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
I just don't think we can't forget that. That's a big part.
I would agree with that. We get complaints every day about the poor lousy service up at the county or and how long it takes. I agree that we gotta have better service. I'm not arguing that point at all. I was trying to get a grip on where the other 25% comes from.
And Jim, my point was that all the benefits that we do get from the community development, that really can't be shown in this.
And I understand that, Billy. I never said we don't get some benefit. But you know, still, when you sit down and you plan on spending money, you like to know where it's coming
Sure.
from.
Of course.
Great, thank you.
That brings us to the capital that we have in the general fund for this year. And we're also taking the department-wide approach with capital as well, which you'll see more on the next budget workshop. But as we go through these, the number on the page number reference refers to the supplemental book, which is all the council members have been given. It's also available on our website for the general public. We talk about funding. We have an initial here, and that's summarized below, and then the amount. And we'll get into this a lot more in our next workshop when we have a lot of capital related to utilities and public works. But this is our capital that we'll be talking about today. We have the time and attendance software system, which is an ongoing project. This is a carryover from the current year. It's paid for out of the general fund as well as cost recovery to the other funds that have employees, which are most of them. That's B51 and next year. The community development permit and inspection implementation, a new system to help to replace the current system, which is out of date and needs to have more automation associated with it to help that customer service level. This is a joint project that is through Public Works, who also has inspectors and the other areas of the city. This amount that's shown here is just the amount being paid from the general fund. Again, at the next workshop, when we look at Public Works, we'll be looking at that total project. Some rodeo grounds electrical work, which has become critical on a safety issue that the city manager and the department feel need to be in this year's budget. It's a multiple year project. It's going to be about 1.4 million over both years, with 925 in the 2017 budget, and that will be funded from the general fund. Fire department has this program, which I believe the chief talked about a few weeks ago when he was doing his update on the service levels. Again, it's coming from the general fund. More details are in the backup book. Police department needed a high capacity copier for the records area. That is here. The regional communication, we have which we've talked about today. Also, the public safety or the computer-aided dispatch CAD system, $1 million. That was a project in the 16 budget, which didn't get completed. It's been in the works, so we're carrying that over to the 17 budget. And then a new recording system. And again, more details can be found on these pages, and again, we can address any questions you have. Recreation has the 3.8 million, which we've mentioned a few times today, coming from the streets fund as that reserve, possible reserve. The pay station expansion and replacement at 125,000, and that refers to additional trailheads which are in the backup for that area. The golf course has some real equipment needs out there that they need a budget next year of 43,400, and Acker Park improvements a 19,800 related to Acker Park. Those were developer funded. The Tinney Ranch development had to give the city money to take care of these developments, but we still have to budget for them to have them happen. So with that, we're looking at all these projects equaling 6.2 million. Funding is down here, with the general fund budget being 2.3, which 1.8 coming out of the fund. Cost recovery from other funds is 16, and partnering related to the CAD system and our partners in that project coming here. That funding is yet to be determined. Will probably be over multiple years, as it was when we established the dispatch center, where they paid the repaid the city for the capital investment over a 5-year period or a 10-year period. And then there's other funding, the 3.8, and the golf course.
Mark, I'd just like to make a comment about the open space acquisitions. I'm really pleased to see that in the budget, and I sincerely hope the rest of the council supports that, because we don't have the money anymore coming in, and this is our last opportunity to complete or do as much as we can with our open space program. Prescott has such a unique asset within its urban boundary, and we know we're going to grow significantly to the north. And in the not too distant future, in our lifetimes, we're going to have a real treasure with a complete, nice, comprehensive core of a wilderness-like place where people can go within a 5-minute drive or even walk from their homes. And I really think it's important that we set aside a reserve fund for those future acquisitions to fill in the holes.
Thank you. Looking at the vehicle replacement fund, which is what we use to take care of the fleet in the general fund, and again, we'll have a lot more discussion on fleet in general next budget workshop, because Field and Facilities is part of that workshop, and they manage the fleet services area. But currently, in this budget, what's being budgeted to replace are these 5 vehicles. With this budgeted for 17, we're looking at an estimated balance remaining in the fleet replacement fund of about $1 million at the end of the year. The fleet replacement funding was one of those things that went away during the downturn, and we've been living off the balance that was accumulated prior to that. So that will be an issue that will need to be addressed in future budgets as to, how do we fund that. There's a couple different options we'll be looking at as we put together the future budgets.
Question on the patrol vehicles. Do they come in with all the ancillary equipment, the computers and everything else, or is that just the basic vehicle?
I believe this number includes all the additional equipment that's needed, lights, radios. I'm getting a nod from the fleet manager, so. Okay, with that, just want to do a summary here of the general fund and point out some things as we go through. We talked about the revenues early on. As you can see, we have an 8% increase over the prior year in the revenues. We have transfers in from the bed tax, which is our next fund we'll be looking at. They're the same as they were. Our operating expenses, including all of these challenges we've had this year with PSPRS and implementing the pay for performance, but with all the adjustments and modifications of service levels that council and staff were looked at and took in the mid-year, our whole operating budget is only up 4%. I think that, that speaks to being able to do these and things that are important to the community and make the changes that needed to happen for council to do that. That gives us a net surplus from our operations of our operating expenses over our operating revenue of $2.2 million, which is good. That's used to fund capital and other things as we go forward. That's an increase from where we were in last year's budget, which is good. And it also gives that capacity as we face these increases in PSPRS that we showed earlier in the future years, if revenues don't continue to grow as we hope. There's capital and transfers related to grants in the airport in this section of the screen. Again, we looked at the $2.3 million in capital that's in this year's budget. We had the cost recovery from other funds. We have transfers to the airport, which we'll be talking about next budget workshop when we talk about the airport. And then our grant transfers, and these are dependent, of course, on the city getting those grants. So these are not definite things, but they do need to be budgeted. So we do present them here, as well as the other airport transfers for a total transfer of about $3.7 million. that brings a net change in our fund balance. Using some of our fund balance, and again, we're budgeting to use some of our reserve fund balance for these capital and other things, which are what you do with a savings account, if you want to think of the fund balance as that, of 1.4 million down. So the beginning fund balance is 29 million. We're projecting at 29,500,000, and that is up from what it was estimated to be. And again, last year we estimated the ending to be 26.7. Now we're projecting it's going to be 29.5. The reason for that is revenues were coming in above projection. Sales tax revenues and other revenues are coming in above projection. Expenditures with the turnover rates and the vacancy rates, or expenditures are not at what they were. So we're, instead of a reduction of 1.2 to our fund balance from fiscal year 16 activity, we're actually had an increase of 1.5 million, which is approximately what we're proposing in this budget to use to spend. So the ending fund balance at the end of 17 is projected to be 28 million, 28.1 million, and that's the fund balance and reserve. We have different categories of reserves. The next slide actually has more detail on those, so I'm going to go ahead and flip to that. The fund reserve policy that council adopted calls for a 20% reserve. It calls for a 10% reserve for unanticipated expenditures and a 10% reserve for the differential in timing between revenue and expenditures. So that's a $7 million reserve that the policy requires us to have, and of course that's in place. We have the golf course interfund loan. Again, we've talked about that numerous times in the past, not recently though, but the golf course had deficit operations for a lot of years, and it accumulated a negative cash or negative fund balance position, and that is an internal loan from the general fund of 4.3. There's other internal loans throughout the year. A lot of our grants are reimbursement, so we have to front the money and then we get reimbursed. So we keep a small reserve. It was $25,000 at the last audit, so we just projected it will approximately be about that amount. We had a structured loan between water, wastewater, and the general fund that was for multiple years, and that pays off in 17. So again, that reserve will go away. So the internal reserve will only be 4.3. The reserve for retirement liabilities, several years ago, the council at the time changed the benefit package for city employees. It was in 2012, eliminating a retirement bonus that was available. There were several employees that were grandfathered in, and as we have in turnover, we have fewer and fewer employees that are still grandfathered in. There's only about 280 of our employees are still eligible for that as we move forward. So that amount goes down every year, but that reserve is to meet that liability that was given by previous policy. So that leaves an unassigned fund balance of $14.5 million. And again, that's, think of it as a savings account available for the council to use for capital projects or other projects or issues as we go forward. And that's what we're using or projecting to use a portion of to fund the needed capital for this next year. So with that, it concludes kind of the general fund today. Any questions on general fund before we move on to bed tax? So we'll move on to our bed tax fund. Now in the bed tax fund, obviously we have the 3% bed tax, brings in, we're projecting $820,000. We've had significant increase in that over the years, related to, probably more related to increasing fees for rooms as opposed to increasing rooms, but it is there. We have the liquor license, which is put here because it has the same restrictions as the bed tax. It needs to be used for that industry, that tourism. Now the other day at council when we were discussing business license, there was some concern by the public that the liquor licenses should be reduced, eliminated, or that type of thing. Again, that's up to council to direct staff if they want us to bring that back. But it does bring in $70,000 into this fund, which is used in the spending of the fund. That gives us $892,000 $100,000 in the fund, and this is where our spending is. You can see there was an increase in tourism relating to the transfer of a position to this area. We also had an increase in our PDP contract with the summer concert series being moved to PDP for management, and council directed that they wish that to come out of the bed tax. Then we have the rest of the different projects that are brought forward with a budget of $907,000 for the current projects. And again, little issue here is the fact that we only have $892 in revenue, but we're budgeting $907 in expenditures. And if we reduce the liquor license, of course, that'll reduce the revenues further. There is fund balance of estimated to be $313,000 in this fund, so it's more of a long-term issue than a short-term issue. You don't want a deficit spend for operational. Now, I'm not sure if you would call all these items operational or not. They're projects, they're things to bring in tourism. But it is something to keep in mind that the bed tax, as structured now, is pretty well committed.
The allocations for the bed tax for next fiscal year will be in the form of a recommendation from the Tourism Advisory Commission?
Yes, and that comes usually in August.
Okay, so these
These
specific
are
dollar figures are just estimates for now, placeholders?
Yeah, they're basically what was suggested or what was budgeted last year and adopted by council.
Okay, thanks.
Excuse me, Mark.
Yes, sir.
There's a 63% increase in the tourism expenditure. What is included in tourism?
That's the tourism department, the salary and all the costs associated with our tourism manager. And the marketing and the website, the tourism website. And
so that's different than marketing and promotion?
Yeah, that's, I'll let.
Sorry. Maybe I can explain this more clearly. Not that you're not doing a wonderful job, Mark.
It's sorry. Okay.
We have two full-time positions that are budgeted there. That's the primary cost that's there. We used to budget the marketing coordinator. I don't remember his exact title, but Tim McAlphin works very hard in the valley and in our key tourism areas to promote Prescott to the tourism and lodging industry, to the hoteliers, to the concierge, so they'll come up here to the bus association. So he used to be budgeted in marketing and promotion, and now that is solely for advertising, marketing, promotion to get to those markets that we get destination visitors from. So the tourism line went up, which is primarily salaries, because we moved the salary from marketing and promotion to tourism, and then we left marketing and promotion at the same amount. So what that really shows is an increase in our ability to do marketing and promotion outside of the area to bring more tourism in, and then they can utilize the open space, the trails, that come to the events, stay in the hotel rooms, keep driving the dollar amount in bed tax and sales tax up because of their visit.
Okay,
so that's what it is. It's an investment in the actual advertising, tourism, and promotion.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I could, Allison, just to make it clear, $290,000 is strictly, let me just, for the sake of argument, ads and billboards and whatnot and things like that.
Yes, that's what that is. It's also going to the trade shows and getting out there in front of the concierge, the bus and tour operators, and all of those things that we do in order to promote Prescott as a destination, to bring those tours, to bring the buses, to bring the people in.
Now, 290 has no salary in that line.
No.
Okay. And then the 63% is because we shifted in December, I believe, the salary from general fund to that line, right?
No,
The director of tourism was always in this?
It's been there for several years.
Okay.
We've had all of the tourism salaries here since, I believe, last year. It's just that we had Tim McAlphin's salary was in the marketing and promotion. Essentially, what's happened here is that we're using the entire $290,000 for marketing and promotion now, and so that's part of why you see that increase in the total expenditures at the bottom. Rather than continuing to let that go to fund balance, we're going to spend it on trying to get more people here to drive up revenue.
And nothing, I love Prescott Creek's one of my favorite organizations, but why are they in the tourism?
They do a lot of maintenance in Watson Woods.
I understand that we pay
premier
them, but I was just
destination
wondering
location.
why it's under tourism.
Well, they do a lot of maintenance in the Watson Woods, which is a huge
Okay.
trailhead
All
destination.
right, that makes sense. I didn't want tourism paying for the creek cleanup, but that makes sense.
One additional comment, and Mark pointed this out. If you looked at this slide from last year, you'd see a contingency line item in here. That's gone. So, as has been expressed, instead of reducing the marketing and promotion, the actual off-site generation of interest, instead of reducing that and keeping a contingency,
Right.
the contingency has gone away. The marketing and promotion has basically been increased.
Okay, so you've like put those placeholders in and just solidified where they went.
Yeah, but as Mark points out, without budgeting a contingency, the projected revenue is 892, the projected expenditures are 907.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Mark, I don't know if Don Prince is in the room or not, but certainly the increase in tourism has been pretty dramatic as a result of how this bed tax has been spent. So I think we just have to be very careful with this bed tax because it brings a lot of revenue into the city.
Right. And as we said, there is a fund balance left over from expenditures in prior years that didn't happen, as well as revenues being above projection, and that's about 297. So, you do have that
Cushion.
That cushion, but, as it stands right now with these changes, you're spending everything and a little bit more. And if council decides that they want to take a look at liquor licenses and change that would, of course, reduce the revenues here as well.
And if I may.
Thank you for bringing that up one more time. I find it offensive to charge a legal business that's doing business in the city, that has invested lots of money in the city, that generates sales tax in the city. Not only do we charge them for permission to sell their product in the city, liquor license, now we're going to charge them a business license on top of it, and I think that needs to be revisited.
I concur.
Mayor, if I may add one more thing to this. The Tourism Advisory Committee worked very hard to adjust the, looking for the lineup here, the tourism and community event grant process this year. And so although there's $70,000 budgeted there, there may be a savings there based on some of the new requirements that they've placed on some of those grant applications and spending those on advertising outside of the area to bring people into the event rather than for event operation costs and things of that nature. So I think we may see some shifting there as we move forward with those changes to that process.
Any more questions on tourism?
Just one more comment. The council may wish to think about the liquor license fee in the next 2 weeks before the next budget workshop. If there are any changes, it would be helpful to change the budget instead of, we don't necessarily have to go and have an item on the council agenda for this. If there is a consensus, we can adjust the budget. If there is not an inclination to adjust the budget, then that's fine too.
I think it would be important to hear from Tourism Advisory Committee to see how, or Don Prince or someone, how would this affect? Because it would be an effect, not that I'm against it at all, just that I think it's important that we look at the consequences of doing that, what might be affected.
Okay. Our next area is grants and other small, some of our other smaller special revenue funds, and then our enterprise fund. But I'm getting a little hoarse, and you're sick of looking at me, so I'm going to have Lars take care of the rest of this.
Thank you, Mark. So in case I'm a new face, I'm the budget and tax manager, Lars Johnson. So there's just a few other special revenue funds we'll go over, and the next one is grants. And basically what the grant fund budget is it's appropriation to allow departments to pursue the grants. So they've submitted to us these proposals, I guess, that they want to go apply for these. And obviously these will then come to your review for approval to apply and accept these, but these are their opportunities. I'll go over just a few of them here, and then if you have any particular questions, departments can give some technical details. But so the CDBG is a big one in the general government. That includes both the next year program, which was considered, I think it was approved in the May 3rd council meeting. And as well, there's a carryover from prior years. So that's why it's more than the 273 that was, or 74 that was adopted in the action plan. The city share there, it's actually, the CDBG is a HUD, we're sort of a pass-through agency. So you might wonder what that city share is. It's in regards to a sidewalk project that Public Works is going to be pursuing the CDBG funding for. The cost of the sidewalk exceeds the grant, so that city share will be transferred from the streets fund to cover the rest. All the other city shares are proposed to come from the general fund. So the next one, the fire department FEMA Assistance to Firefighters Grant, that relates to grant applications or opportunities that the fire department will be looking at for certain capital expenditures. They have some things they'd like to purchase if the grant's awarded. And then the SAFER grant we already talked about, that is to restore the minimum staffing for the fire department. And that includes 6 currently filled positions, or currently budgeted positions, as well as 3 additional positions, and that total is $956,000. And then they have quite a few grants that relate to hazardous fuels mitigation, and then also in regards to the Arizona Wildfire and Incident Management Academy. They are successful in getting some grant funding to support that. In Public Works, that's Corsair Avenue Extension. There's actually a grant that was applied for through the Economic Initiatives Department. If you recall from last fall, it came to your attention, and the grant has been awarded, just not accepted at this time. This is a connector street, about a half a mile in the airport district. So $500,000 is excuse me, is expected to come from ADOT, as well as a private partner is expected to take the remaining $800,000. And police has a significant list of grants they would like to pursue. One of them is the COPS hiring grant. Thanks, Mark. They are considering applying for this, so it's just an appropriation to allow them to apply for it, to fund police positions. And then lots of other these are to support operations at the police department. And their total is about $1.7 million worth of grants they're anticipating applying for. One of those is the Victim Advocate Coordinator, which has been awarded and is currently filled. So that's all I have. If there's any particular questions on any of these, the departments can answer.
Just a comment. I think it is commendable that these departments are going after federal and state grants to supplement what we do in the city. Makes me feel a lot better about paying my federal income taxes.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the impact fees. And these are the governmental impact fees. This does not relate to the water and wastewater impact fees. But as you all are aware, the current law in the state has significantly reduced the amount of funding which we can use or collect for new capacity in facilities and infrastructure. In a lot of communities with aging infrastructure, there's two components. There's one is existing deficiency, and the other is new growth. Impact fees are not to be used for existing deficiencies. And with these new restrictions, it's increasingly difficult to finance projects related to new growth. There's some more information about the park impact fee. And the park impact fees were in place from 1995 until 2014. And they were set on an incremental expansion approach. And this means that at the time of the study, they did a cost per citizen method to set the fee. So they studied the existing level of service that we had for our parks, and basically any of the fees that would be collected will then be used to respond to the increase in population to continue that level of service, and not necessarily to create new levels or new services. And that is, according to state law, that is the way this money should be spent. So the levels that were identified in the study that was set to begin collecting these fees related to parkland, park amenities, playgrounds, tennis courts, walkways, trails within the park restrooms, and athletic fields. And there's, just to point out here, there is a project in the 5-year capital plan that intends or is proposing to use nearly all of the balance in this impact fee fund, and that is the $600,000 Keebler field expansion at Pioneer Park. The next slide indicates the fund balances here, which would be the interest, obviously, since these funds are not growing besides interest that is gained on the balances. So parks is at $726,000, fire $894,000, library $454,000, police $857,000, and then public buildings at $173,000. So basically, these fees are no longer being collected, as I said. The latest collections happened up until 2014, when the new impact fee study was done. Public buildings was eliminated in 2011. Any questions here?
So Lars, are you saying that the $726,000, the park impact fee that we often discuss as how we can use it and cannot use it, which is what we hear more of because it's so restrictive. So that has been, 600,000 of that has been identified to be used on the field expansion?
That's correct. Yeah, it's in the 5-year capital. I think that was in FY18 in your backup book. So that is a project that has been submitted by the Recreation Department that is proposing to use that fund.
Good to know.
Okay. Thank you.
So there's 2 additional small but not insignificant special revenue funds. One is the Acker Trust, and that's assets that were willed to the city to be used for parks and promoting music in the community. The Acker Trust Board tries to basically spend the interest earned on the money that's in the account, and about $10,000 is allocated each year to award scholarships to through the grant application process. And the fund balance sits or projected at end of year FY17 $562,000. The gifts and donation fund, Mark has already addressed some of those, but basically any miscellaneous gifts that are given to the city to be used on specific projects or for specific departments will be accounted for in this fund. And some of those do have limited restrictions, some may be more broad, but they are to be used by the departments.
Lars?
Yes.
I just need a clarification. When you put the figure of $255,000 as an expenditure for FY17, that's still contingent upon a decision by the Acker Trust Board, which I think is made in March of each year, whether or not to spend that?
So I think, so you're talking about 255,000 right there is actually under the gifts and donations. Or were you talking about the 10,000? The 10,000, yes, that is the allowance that is budgeted for the Acker Trust Board to then distribute to their applications.
Okay, so the gifts and donations is just a generic gifts and donations
right.
over citywide.
That's correct.
Okay.
These two funds are not related.
Okay, thanks.
But to make it very clear, this just creates the appropriation authority if project or projects come forward that qualify according to the criteria, the gifts and donations, if there are criteria. This is appropriation authority. It is not a particular proposal to expend for a particular purpose.
So some examples of some very reoccurring projects or uses of gifts and donations is Shop with a Cop from the police department. That's something that happens every year. One is bike maps. Money is donated to publish our bike maps for the city. Police dog program. Monies are donated to support our police dogs. Our Police Explorers program, and then Friends of the Library. And for Parks and Rec, it's the Park Ranger Volunteer Program. Okay, so a debt service fund is revenues that are tied to servicing debt. And Mark's already talked about this, and that is primarily has been in the past and will be completed this year is the general obligation bonds to purchase the two lakes that we have, and that will be finalized in FY17. And all that will be remaining in this fund will then be a small special assessment sanitation district. The billings and the debt service are handled through this fund. And finally, we have one enterprise fund, and that is the golf course. We have a simplified schedule here this year, and our revenues are pretty level, are projected to be pretty level from Billy Casper. The operations of the golf course will be continued to be handled by an outside private party, and that is Billy Casper. There is a contingency budgeted both in revenues and expenditures. If revenues come in more than expected, this will allow us to then maybe pursue some of the much-needed capital projects out there and provide some flexibility when we're dealing with a contracted partner. So expenses seem to be going up a little bit for the golf operations, as well as we have some capital expenditures for next year, and that relates to two pieces of equipment that they need for golf maintenance.
Excuse me, Lars.
Yes.
Is there any particular reason why you're projecting a decrease in greens fees this year?
I see Joe coming up, and he will be answering that.
Councilman Shiska, when we put together the FY16 budget, we had been experiencing some pretty good weather years. Of course, golf is a business that's weather dependent. This year, in fiscal year 16, we have had 18 days where we've had no play because of snow or temperatures that were below, freezing. So what we did in the fiscal year 17 budget is kind of got a little more realistic about what those days might look like. So that's why.
Yeah, I was just concerned that you were not thinking that, okay, we are becoming less popular, and so that was the reason for the decrease.
We just took a more conservative approach, and good weather, we'll have a good season. Bad weather, we'll have covered that. So that was the approach.
Okay, thank you.
So that covers the funds we wanted to cover today. And again, we'll be having our next workshop on the 26th, where we'll be covering the streets, utilities, the solid waste and the airport, those enterprise activities, as well as the special revenue activity of the streets fund. Following that, the city manager covered these a little earlier, but the tentative budget is set to be considered by council on the 7th at the regular meeting. And then the public hearings, which there are 3, I believe, 2 or 3, are scheduled to be the 21st of June, and then council consideration of the final budget after that. And then property taxes will follow after through the public hearings in July. So with that, we'd be glad to answer any questions relating to today, or anything, any area you want more detail on as we get ready for the next workshop. You can let us know now, or you can let the city manager know, and we will be sure and include that.
Thank you.
With that, we are done.
Okay, thank you, City Manager. I appreciate everything your staff has done, and look forward to the next workshop and seeing what else we have to deal with. Meeting adjourned.